This is Faith Ignited, the podcast where we put God back into history. Episode 25, Nothing to Fear from Lies. Patsy stood in the corner of the room, tears quietly leaking from her eyes. Her small, shaking hands gripped the fabric of her dress as she and the others in the room awaited the slow, awful arrival of death. Her mother lay in bed, her beautiful face pale, her breathing ragged. Every breath she took seemed like a fraying thread connecting her to life, connecting her to them. She was too young to die, Patsy thought. Far too young. For the first time in her life, Patsy was beginning to contemplate what life might look like without her mother in it. Her approaching 10th birthday now felt hollow and meaningless. The future seemed bleak. Her father sat near her mother's bedside, holding her hand in his. He looked dreadful. The past months had taken a great toll on him, evidenced by the weary droop of his shoulders and the dark shadows beneath his eyes. He had declined his recent re-election to the Virginia House of Delegates, ignoring the criticism of friends and neighbors who were unaware of the situation, knowing that his place was with his wife. No nurse or female had ever cared for a patient with more tenderness or anxiety. He had nursed her mother night and day, administering her medicines. For 4 long months, he'd never been out of calling. When he wasn't at her mother's bedside, he was writing in a small room that opened immediately at the head of her bed. Now he sat there, rigid as a statue, and nearly as pale as his wife. His eyes were fixed on her face, with a look of desperate determination, as though he might will her to live, will her to stay. She was too weak to speak, but managed to gesture for a paper and quill to be brought. With a trembling hand, she began to write. It was a passage from a novel both she and Patsy's father loved, Lawrence Sterne's Tristram Shandy. "Time wastes too fast," she wrote. "Every letter I trace tells me with what rapidity life follows my pen. The days and hours of it are flying over our heads, like clouds of a windy day, never to return more. Everything presses on." At that point, too weak to write any more, Patsy's father gently took the paper and finished penning the words. "And every time I kiss thy hand to bid adieu, every absence which follows it are preludes to that eternal separation which we are shortly to make." Patsy heard him vow that he would never marry again. Then they all sat in profound silence, aside from the quiet crying heard throughout the room, as her mother inhaled and exhaled one last time. Immediately her father's shoulders began to rack with sobs, his hands covering his face. Patsy's aunt, Mrs. Carr, went to him. With great difficulty, she took him by the shoulders and led him from the room. Patsy followed them to the library, watching as her father's knees gave way and he collapsed. He lay insensible for so long that they feared he might never again regain consciousness. Patsy was ushered from the room and did not witness the scene that followed. But later that night, she crept out of bed, quietly moving through the corridors of Monticello, drawn by the sounds of her father's grief. She stealthily entered his room, and the scene that met her eyes was too terrible to describe. Never had she witnessed a display of such agony, such utter heart-wrenching sorrow. Slowly she went to his side, determined not to leave him in this state of mourning. As she sat with him, her own heart was breaking. Heaven only knew why her mother should be taken now, in the prime of her life, at a time when she was so greatly needed by her family. Whatever the reasons were, Patsy was sure that nothing would ever be the same. Winston Churchill, the British's bulldog during World War II, made this astute observation: "You have enemies? Good. That means you've stood up for something sometime in your life." Elbert Hubbard said something along those same lines. Quote, "To avoid criticism, say nothing, do nothing, be nothing." What these two men, highly influential in their own spheres, understood that we should also understand is that the only way to avoid making mistakes and opening yourself up to the scorn of the public is to never do anything, to sit on the sidelines and not play the game at all. And you know what? A lot of mankind has taken this course, content to be led rather than lead, and to criticize rather than to compete. These are often the people who mock others for trying, as they themselves do nothing. The ones who, as Christ put it, see the mote in their brother's eye while ignoring the beam in their own eye. I'm always amazed when I hear people criticize the Founding Fathers, flaunting a sort of self-perceived moral superiority. I mean, really? Morally superior? Show me another group of men who worked harder, sacrificed more, or were as brilliant or as virtuous. Now do they have their flaws? Of course they did. And the nation certainly had a long ways to develop and improve after the founding era. But attempting to criticize them is akin to watching Olympic gymnastics and making some snide remark about an athlete who stumbles in their landing, as we lounge on the couch and shove potato chips in our mouths. It shows a complete lack of understanding of who these men were, what they faced, and what they accomplished. They had enemies in their day, and their modern enemies like to quote the enemies of the past, but personally, I would not want someone to get a read of my character from someone who despised me and was highly motivated to discredit me. That's like turning to Judas Iscariot to learn about Christ. You'd be much wiser to ask Peter to give you a reliable history. The fact of the matter is, anyone who seeks to do good in this world will be opposed. Back in the 70s, an author named Fawn M. Brody wrote a book that she titled Thomas Jefferson, An Intimate History. It's probably her most famous work. And in this psychobiography, she claims to give you a glimpse into the personal life of Thomas Jefferson. It's focused primarily on his supposed lust for one of his slaves, and his near schizophrenic behavior as he tries to portray himself as an upstanding man of honor to the public while secretly concealing his scandalous behavior behind closed doors. If you visit his home Monticello in Virginia, you'll hear this exact narrative. In fact, most of the intellects of our day will tell you unequivocally that Jefferson fathered children with one of his slaves. But the more you study Thomas Jefferson, especially his own words, the more you see that this is a complete contradiction of his character. It doesn't fit. The only way they try to explain it is to say that he basically was a schizophrenic, that he was a man of contradictions. But what it really boils down to is whether we believe Jefferson was a liar or whether he was telling the truth. In the previous episode, we discussed a lot of Jefferson's origins and the first half of his life. And I know I said that we would just do one more episode on Jefferson, but as I've gotten into studying and writing, I realized it would not be possible. So in this episode, we'll highlight the period right after the Revolution, talk about Jefferson's character, and specifically address the issue of Sally Hemings. I'll be doing one more episode after this, where we talk about his faith and convictions. But as for this episode, I intend to give you an intimate history of Thomas Jefferson that in no way resembles Mrs. Brody's. Picking up where we left off, we ended with the British forces under Cornwallis and Tarleton sweeping through central Virginia, forcing the legislature to flee and nearly capturing Jefferson and Monticello. At this time, Jefferson was in his second year as governor of Virginia. He chose not to run for a third term, and the legislature elected Thomas Nelson as his replacement. But bitter accusations followed Jefferson's governorship. Some accused him of cowardice, even saying that he was wrong to flee before Tarleton's army. But as Andrew M. Allison notes, quote, "The resolution to investigate Jefferson's governorship apparently sprang from the desire of some officials to find a scapegoat for the humiliation they suffered at the hands of the British Army. But when Jefferson appeared before the House of Delegates to defend his administration, the two houses of the legislature unanimously acquitted him of all charges of malfeasance. They responded, quote, "Resolved that the sincere thanks of the General Assembly be given to our former governor, Thomas Jefferson, Esquire, for his impartial, upright, and attentive administration whilst in office. The Assembly wish in the strongest manner to declare the high opinion which they entertain of Mr. Jefferson's ability, rectitude, and integrity as Chief Magistrate of this Commonwealth, and mean by thus publicly avowing their opinion to obviate and to remove all unmerited censure." Despite this, Jefferson's political enemies would later still try to claim that he failed in his responsibilities as a governor. And some biographers still like to resurrect this issue, despite the fact that George Washington himself praised Jefferson for his readiness and zeal in forwarding the cause of the war, which was very different than many of the governors of that period. But Jefferson was weary of politics, especially after his frustrating and stressful governorship and the accusations that followed afterwards. So as the War for Independence was coming to a close, Jefferson wrote to a friend saying that he had taken his final leave of politics and that he had, quote, "retired to my farm, my family, and books, from which I think nothing will ever separate me." But Jefferson's peaceful time at home was short-lived. During the early months of 1782, he became increasingly concerned about the poor health of his wife Martha. Jefferson had married a little later in life. He was 29 and his bride was 23. Martha Skelton was married to her first husband for only about 2 years before he became ill and died, leaving her a wealthy widow before she was 20 years old. Her father, John Wales, was a fellow attorney, and in 1770, Jefferson began making frequent visits to the Wales home, not to discuss law, but to become better acquainted with Martha. This description given by one of her descendants gives us an idea of why she drew Jefferson's attention. Quote, "She is described as having been very beautiful, a little above middle height, with a lithe and exquisitely formed figure. She was the model of grace and queen-like carriage. Nature, so lavish with her charms for her, to great personal attractions added a mind of no ordinary caliber. She was well educated for her day, and a constant reader. She inherited from her father his method and industry, as the accounts kept in her clear handwriting and still in the hands of her descendants testify. Her well-cultivated talent for music served to enhance her charms not a little in the eyes of such a musical devotee as Jefferson." Jefferson certainly had competition for Martha's affections, but he had some advantages, one of which was their shared love of music. When Jefferson would call on Martha, they'd often perform musical duets together. According to family tradition, one day 2 rival suitors arrived on the Wales' doorstep, both intending to call on Martha. They were shown into the front hallway, but before either could enter the drawing room, they heard the sounds of a touching song from behind the door. Along with the violin and harpsichord, the accompanying voices of Jefferson and his lady love were soon recognized, and the 2 disconcerted lovers, after exchanging a glance, picked up their hats and left. Jefferson proposed the next year, and they were married at her father's estate on New Year's Day of 1772. After the wedding and festivities, the newlyweds departed for Monticello, over 100 miles away. They arrived in a blizzard and eventually had to abandon their carriage altogether and make the last 8 miles of the journey on horseback through 2 feet of snow. A small brick building was the only finished portion of the estate at that time, and when they arrived, it was, quote, "late at night, the fires all out, and the servants retired to their own houses for the night. Too happy in each other's love, however, to be long troubled by the dreariness of a cold and dark house, and having found a bottle of wine on a shelf behind some books, The young couple refreshed themselves with its contents and startled the silence of the night with song and merry laughter. During the 10 years of their marriage, the Jeffersons would have 6 children, only 2 of which would survive to adulthood, and only one that would outlive Jefferson himself. Martha had just given birth to their 6th child when her health began to fail. Alarmed, Jefferson declined his re-election to the Virginia House of Delegates and spent all of his time at his wife's bedside. Their daughter Martha, nicknamed Patsy, wrote, "As a nurse, no female ever had more tenderness nor anxiety. He nursed my poor mother, sitting up with her and administering her medicines and drink to the last. For 4 months that she lingered, he was never out of calling. When not at her bedside, he was writing in a small room which opened immediately at the head of her bed." September 6, 1782, marked the darkest day in Thomas Jefferson's life. Describing her mother's death, Martha wrote, "A moment before closing the scene, he, her father, was led from the room in a state of insensibility by his sister, Mrs. Carr, who with great difficulty got him into the library, where he fainted, and remained so long insensible that they feared he never would revive. The scene that followed I did not witness, but the violence of his emotion, when almost by stealth I entered his room by night, to this day I dare not describe to myself. He kept his room 3 weeks, and I was never a moment from his side. He walked almost incessantly night and day, only lying down occasionally when nature was completely exhausted, on a pallet that had been brought in during his long fainting fit. My aunts remained constantly with him for some weeks. I do not remember how many. When at last he left his room, he rode out, and from that time he was incessantly on horseback, rambling about the mountain in the least frequented roads, and just as often through the woods. In those melancholy rambles, I was his constant companion, a solitary witness to many a burst of grief." Allison explains how Jefferson was affected by this loss. Quote, "In the preceding 7 years, Jefferson had buried his mother, 2 young daughters, and an infant son, and his wife's repeated illnesses during this period had certainly not offered much promise, but in spite of it all, he seemed quite unprepared for this latest and most devastating event." Martha was only 33 years old at the time of her passing. Jefferson reflected that in 1782 he had, quote, "lost the cherished companion of my life, in whose affections I had lived the last 10 years in uncheckered happiness." He never married again, and his remaining children became more important to him than anything else in his life. He wrote to Martha saying, "Nobody in this world can make me so happy or so miserable as you. To your sister and yourself I look to render the evening of my life serene and contented. Its morning has been clouded by loss after loss, till I have nothing left but you." Jefferson also said, "It is in the love of one's family only that heartfelt happiness is known," and he called children the keystone of the arch of matrimonial happiness. Despite the fact that they were married only 10 years, Martha's influence on Jefferson was profound, and would remain with him over the remaining 44 years of his life. His grief for her was intense, but her death changed the course of his life. A couple of months after she died, he wrote to a friend saying that he found himself, quote, "a little emerging from the stupor of mind which had rendered me as dead to the world as she was whose loss occasioned it. Before that event, my scheme of life had been determined. I had folded myself in the arms of retirement, and rested all prospects of future happiness on domestic and literary objects. A single event wiped away all my plans, and left me a blank which I had not the spirits to fill up." Martha's death frustrated Jefferson's plans for retirement, but it wasn't long after that the nation came calling. Thomas's weary eyes drooped, his head bobbing as he tried to lean it against the carriage window. He was feeling travel-worn after days of riding through the countryside, not to mention his boat ride across the English Channel. A large dip in the road made his eyes fly back open. He wasn't going to be able to sleep anyway. He had far too much on his mind. Across from him, 13-year-old Patsy stirred slightly in her seat. She had managed to doze despite the jostling carriage, her arms curled protectively around a worn copy of Plutarch's Lives that had slipped from her lap to the floor. Thomas leaned forward gently, retrieving the book and tucking it beside her. His gaze lingered on her young face, his eyes tender with fatherly affection. She had been his steadfast companion for the past 2 years, ever since he had brought her with him to France. Her quiet presence was a balm to his grief, a glimpse of Martha in the curve of her brow or the tone of her voice. Due to the nature of his responsibilities and the danger of sea travel, he had decided to leave his 2 youngest daughters, Mary, Polly to friends and family, and Lucy Elizabeth in the care of their aunt and uncle, when he'd accepted his call to serve as a minister in France. It had come as yet another crushing blow when he'd received word that little Lucy Elizabeth had taken ill with whooping cough and died. Patsy and Polly were all he had left in the world. After hearing of Lucy Elizabeth's passing, he had begun making arrangements for Polly to join them in Europe. God willing, they would all be together again soon. Thomas's hand unconsciously moved to the seat beside him, the silence of the carriage bringing a wave of familiar melancholy. Martha had been dead for 3.5 years, and yet his heart still ached for her. She was always somewhere in the back of his thoughts, and he'd finally concluded that this wound would never fully heal until they were reunited again. His only consolations were his daughters, and that he might still be of service to his country. At first, he'd been quite intimidated about taking over Benjamin Franklin's role as minister to France. It was obvious from the start that Franklin was adored by the French people, more so than any other person, foreign or native. Trying to fill his place had been an excellent school of humility. When being presented to anyone as the Minister of America, the most commonplace question was always, "Is it you, sir, who replaced Dr. Franklin?" To which Thomas typically responded, "No one can replace him, sir. I am merely his successor." But over the past 20 months that he'd spent in France, Thomas had begun to develop his own reputation as a diplomat, and had acquired a deep appreciation for the French people, who were as generous and as welcoming a people as he could ever have hoped for. Lafayette had proved a great friend and ally in seeking a union with the French and Americans, even after the War for Independence. He also knew that Lafayette was eager to introduce the principles of republican government among his own people, and if Thomas wasn't wrong, that time might not be far distant. Things were growing tense in France, like a taut trap ready to spring. Things were rather strained in America too, though not for the same reasons. Thomas thought back to a recent letter that he had received from his friend and fellow Virginian, James Madison, who was concerned about the state of affairs in the New World. Everyone knew that the Articles of Confederation were doomed to fail. A loose alliance among the states was simply not enough to bind them together, and with Congress unable to tax or raise an army, America was vulnerable to attack from other nations. John Adams, who was acting as minister to Britain, had even said that King George III was prepared to negotiate with the states individually, clearly still hoping for a return of the colonies into the subjection of Great Britain. Thomas recoiled at the thought. He was most definitely in favor of a new form of government, if only the states could be brought together. As it was, a house divided against itself could not stand. Of that, he was sure. Suddenly, Thomas's eyes were drawn to the horizon, where he noticed a city gradually emerging from the green countryside, dark and imposing. He watched with some anticipation for his first glimpse of London, a place he'd once considered the heart of the mother country, before those ties had been severed. As the carriage approached, Thomas gently nudged Patsy's shoulder, not wanting her to miss the sight. Patsy," he murmured. "We're nearly there." Her eyes fluttered open, and she sat up, turning to the window with great expectation. A great smoky haze hung over the sprawl of buildings, the result of thousands of coal-burning hearths, creating a permanent grayish smudge against the sky. Fields eventually gave way to packed buildings of brick and stone, their chimneys belching soot. Unlike the neater layout of the parish streets, London was crowded and organic, its medieval roots still visible in the architecture. The homes were dirty and dark, and the overcrowded streets bustled with a populace that was generally sullen in appearance. But as the carriage moved past the grimy outskirts of town into the wealthier districts, the roads widened, the buildings became more uniform, and the pedestrians were better dressed. The Georgian-style buildings of this part of town were much more refined, if they didn't have the aesthetic flair of Paris. The carriage came to a smooth halt in front of a red-bricked townhome in Grosvenor Square. The townhouse door swung open, and John Adams emerged, descending the steps to greet Thomas as he exited the carriage. "Thomas," he said warmly, "you've arrived in fine time." Thomas brushed the road dust from his sleeve, responding, "London greets me with coal smoke and gray skies, but your face is a welcome sight, John." Adams chuckled, then offered a hand which Thomas shook. Just then, Patsy stepped carefully from the carriage, and Adams' expression softened. "And Miss Jefferson, my goodness, you've grown since I last saw you." Patsy curtsied shyly. "It's good to see you again, Mr. Adams." At that moment, the door opened wider, and Abigail Adams appeared on the stoop, coming forward to offer Thomas and Patsy an equally warm greeting. As they were ushered inside, the two men began discussing the commercial treaties that they hoped to negotiate with Great Britain and Portugal, as well as their meeting with the diplomats of the Barbary States, whose pirates had been raiding American ships. When John had written requesting Thomas's aid, he had immediately made plans to travel to England. It was good to see John again. They had worked well together during the Revolution, and he considered him a good friend. Hopefully their negotiation skills combined would be enough to secure the necessary agreements. Though Thomas's stay in London wasn't overly long, it was eventful. Just days after their arrival, he found himself standing in the gilded halls of St. James's Palace, the official residence of the British monarch. Courtiers milled about in lavish attire, and the ornate walls shimmered with candlelight and gold leaf. It represented everything that Thomas despised about monarchical government. The pomp and the pretense symbolized their distance from the people and principle. John seemed more at ease in the setting. He'd been through this process before, but as for Thomas, he awaited his introduction to the king with some apprehension. It was unlikely that the ruler would soon forget the stinging effect of Thomas's pen. Writing the Declaration of Independence would earn him no friends in this setting. John and Thomas's names were announced, and the two men approached, offering the customary bows. The king was arrayed in extravagant robes, a scepter in his hand. As they moved closer, Thomas searched the face of the man he'd once considered his king. There was no warmth. The monarch's gaze had swept over the two Americans with a chill that could have frozen glass. No words, no smile, not even the cursory nod that he had offered to lesser diplomats. The king's grudge, it seemed, had aged like vinegar. His reception of the two Americans, Thomas in particular, could not have been more ungracious. But as they walked away, Thomas merely felt resolved. A new era of liberty was dawning, and if Thomas had anything to say about it, the aristocratic government that he witnessed here would never again have place in America. The historical period immediately following the conclusion of the American Revolution was a time of great uncertainty, not just in America, but in Europe as well. It raised the great question of what a free people would do with their independence. It became clear right away that the Articles of Confederation, which was the first form of government that the states operated under when they declared their independence, was not sufficient long-term. It was basically a loose alliance, and so America didn't have power to raise an army or navy or to declare war. And already we found ourselves being harassed by the likes of the Barbary States, who were raiding American ships on the seas, and the government could do nothing about it. But we'll come back to the Barbary pirates, because this is going to be an issue that Jefferson later has to address when he becomes president. But the previous narrative took place in 1786, and a year later, the Constitutional Convention would take place, officially uniting the states and creating a government that would last longer and create greater peace and prosperity than any other in history. Jefferson himself was not able to physically take part in the Constitutional Convention because he was working as a diplomat in France at the time. But he exerted his influence through frequent letters to his good friend James Madison. Jefferson was also one of the foremost to push for a Bill of Rights. But as America continued the peaceful conclusion of its revolution, France was just beginning to reel from theirs. In a letter to a friend, Jefferson described the general fate of humanity in France as, quote, most deplorable, and that the great mass of people are thus suffering under physical and moral oppression. Although Jefferson did not agree with the morals of Parisian society, he did develop a great love for the French people, saying that, a more benevolent people I have never known, nor greater warmth and devotedness in their select friendships. Their kindness and accommodation to strangers is unparalleled, and the hospitality of Paris is beyond anything I had conceived to be practicable in a large city. In fact, Jefferson went so far as to say that if he could choose any country outside of his own to live in, it would be France. He was able to appreciate French culture while rejecting the more unwholesome aspects of French society, which he certainly noticed and did not approve of. He even worried about American youth being sent to school in Europe. He observed that a young man would acquire, quote, a fondness for European luxury and dissipation, and a contempt for the simplicity of his own country. He is fascinated with the privileges of the European aristocrats, and sees with abhorrence the lovely equality which the poor enjoy with the rich in his own country. He contracts a partiality for aristocracy or monarchy. And then he goes on to say this, he is led by the strongest of all the human passions into a spirit for female intrigue, destructive of his own and others' happiness, or a passion for whores, destructive of his health, and in both cases learns to consider fidelity to the marriage bed as an ungentlemanly practice, and inconsistent with happiness. He recollects the voluptuary dress and arts of the European women, and pities and despises the chaste affections and simplicity of those in his own country. It appears to me, then, that an American coming to Europe for education loses in his knowledge, in his morals, in his health, in his habits, and in his happiness. I had entertained only doubts on this head before I came to Europe. What I see and hear since I came here proves more than I had even suspected. But despite these observations, as Jefferson witnessed the beginning of revolution in France, he had great hopes that republicanism might still be introduced among the French people, and from there, hopefully to the rest of Europe. Jefferson remained in France only long enough to see the storming of the Bastille, considered the signaling event of the French Revolution. But a couple of months later, he was on his way back to America with his 2 daughters, having spent about 5 years among the French people. When he returned to Monticello, he was thrilled to be home, and once again began making some plans for retirement. He wrote, I had rather be shut up in a modest cottage with my books, my family, and a few old friends, dining on simple bacon and letting the world roll on as it liked, than to occupy the most splendid post which any human power can give. But it was not Jefferson's lot in life to sit and eat bacon. Almost immediately after arriving back in America, he received news that George Washington, the newly elected first president, had appointed him as Secretary of State. Jefferson was less than enthused about the opportunity. Once again, his plans for a peaceful retirement were thwarted. But after expressing his own feelings of inadequacy in a letter to George Washington, he concluded, "But it is not for an individual to choose his post. You are to marshal us as may be best for the public good. If you think it better to transfer me to another post, my inclination must be no obstacle." He accepted the position. The room was warm, despite the draft that slipped in through the tall windows of Federal Hall. Thomas sat stiffly in his chair, the freshly polished table between him and the others reflecting the flicker of candlelight. President Washington sat at the head, listening to the matters being discussed by his cabinet members with a thoughtful expression. Thomas himself was known to listen far more than he spoke in meetings, but at the moment he felt words itching to break free as he listened to Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton's perspective on the issue of a federal bank. How he and Hamilton managed to consistently be on polar opposite sides of every issue was astounding. It didn't help that Hamilton was frequently meddling in foreign affairs, trying to increase America's ties with Britain, despite the fact that foreign dealings fell under Thomas's responsibilities as Secretary of State. "We must have a central institution," Hamilton insisted, "one capable of managing debt, issuing credit, and securing the confidence of both domestic and foreign investors. Without it, our economy will remain fractured and weak." Finally, Thomas spoke. "I've listened, Mr. Hamilton," he said evenly, "and I cannot help but feel that this proposal, well-intentioned as it may be, places too much power in the hands of too few. A national bank backed by the federal government risks becoming an instrument not of the people, but of the elite." Hamilton didn't flinch. "And what would you have us do? Let the states drift apart financially? Allow uncertainty to paralyze our nation before it's even begun to stand?" Thomas kept his voice calm but firm. "We did not fight a revolution to trade one monarch for another, nor to wrap our government in robes of ceremony. A national bank under federal control invites the same dangers we sought to escape. It favors the wealthy, invites corruption, and undermines the rights of the states." Hamilton raised a brow. "And without structure, without the tools of governance, how do you propose we preserve the very republic that you claim to defend?" Thomas felt the heat rise in his chest. "By keeping government limited, by ensuring that our officials do not look longingly to European courts for how to govern free men. This government must remain simple, accessible, and grounded in the people, not made into a spectacle of pomp and pretense." Washington said nothing, though his gaze drifted between them, heavy with thought. Thomas folded his arms, biting back the rest of what he wanted to say. He had already voiced his concerns with the president in private. His dismay at the cavalcades, the throne-like addresses, the unnatural formality of it all. He had left the fervor of revolutionary France, where liberty pulsed through the streets, only to come here and find something very different. He had expected to come home to a republic, alive with principle. Instead, he was met with dinner parties, where men openly praised monarchy, where ceremonies mimicked the royal courts, and where even members of the government seemed more enamored with British forms than with Republican simplicity. Hamilton and even John Adams were more intent on preserving a relationship with Great Britain than France, and Thomas especially didn't like their broad interpretation of the Constitution. He'd even heard Hamilton refer to the Constitution once as a shilly-shally thing of mere milk and water, which could not last and was only good as a step to something better. When the meeting finally concluded, Thomas gathered up his notes, feeling weary and frustrated. As much as he loved his nation, he despised the heat and debate of politics. He dreaded the table piled with endless papers and the eternal sound of the doorbell. More and more he longed for his family and his home. He'd come here to fight for and defend Republican principles, but he hadn't expected to be opposed at every turn. When Jefferson arrived in New York to take his position as Secretary of State, he was shocked by what he found. He had left revolutionary France full of excitement for Republican ideals, but in America, many officials, except Washington, seemed to prefer monarchy over democracy. Jefferson was disturbed by the royal-style ceremonies, formalities, and open support for monarchy ideals, which he felt directly clashed with the principles of a republic. Now, this may seem strange to think that this was ever an issue in America, but when Washington's presidency began, there was no existing guideline for how the new government should operate. So officials naturally borrowed practices from the British system that they knew. And being in New York City, which for a time was the seat of government before they moved to Philadelphia and finally Washington, D.C., there was a lot of British influence. New York had always been loyalist-leaning. And it was during this period that the first political parties in America began to emerge. And the unofficial champions of those different parties were Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, leading the party that would be known as the Federalists, who were in support of a strong centralized government and a looser interpretation of the Constitution. And then Thomas Jefferson and James Madison leading the Republican Party, which favored states' rights and a strict interpretation of the Constitution. The two parties were also divided over the French Revolution, with Federalists opposing it and Republicans supporting it, at least the first part of it. The Federalists also wanted to focus on creating stronger ties with Great Britain, and Republicans wanted stronger ties with France. This was the beginning of the two-party system that we have today. And Jefferson, who never enjoyed political battles, was anxious to hand the reins over to someone else and let them take over as Secretary of State. Washington managed to persuade Jefferson not to resign until 1793, a year into his second term. But after that, Jefferson finally went home, saying, "The length of my tether is now fixed for life from Monticello to Richmond. My private business can never call me elsewhere, and certainly politics will not." Does this sound familiar? Once again, he tries to retire. But as you well know, Jefferson was not done in politics. But he did spend several years at home, trying to improve the estate and plantation that had been severely neglected during his absence. A visiting Frenchman was stunned to see Jefferson out working in the fields alongside his servants, not deterred by the scorching heat. Jefferson's overseer, Edmund Bacon, gives us this description of Jefferson. Quote, "His countenance was always mild and pleasant. You never saw it ruffled. No odds what happened. It always maintained the same expression. I have rode over the plantation, I reckon 1,000 times with Mr. Jefferson, and when he was not talking, he was nearly always humming some tune or singing in a low tone to himself." He also records, quote, "Mr. Jefferson was always an early riser, arose at daybreak or before. The sun never found him in bed. I used sometimes to think that when I went up there early in the morning that I could find him in bed, but there he would be before me, walking on the terrace. He did not use tobacco in any form. He never used a profane word or anything like it. He never played cards. I never saw a card at the house in Monticello. Mr. Jefferson was very liberal and kind to the poor. People all about the country would come in crowds to Monticello to beg him. He would give them notes to me, directing me what to give them. I could hardly get it hauled as fast as he would give it away." And after several years back at Monticello, Jefferson was more determined than ever to never leave. He said, "No circumstance, my dear sir, will ever more tempt me to engage in the public." But as the next presidential election approached, James Madison wrote hinting that many Americans hoped to see Jefferson as the next president. Jefferson quickly put any such thoughts to rest, saying, The little spice of ambition which I had in my younger days has long since evaporated, and I set still less store by posthumous than present fame. The question is forever closed with me. But during the 3 years that Jefferson spent at home, he grew more and more concerned with what the Federalist Party was doing in Congress. He hoped that James Madison or another Republican might run, but none of them had the same national popularity as Jefferson, and Madison was the one who led the movement to nominate Jefferson. While Jefferson didn't stop him from putting his name on the ballot, he certainly did no campaigning. In fact, he wrote to a friend saying, "I shall from the bottom of my heart rejoice at escaping." And he even pled with Madison that if he and John Adams, who was the Federalist candidate, should tie for votes, that he, quote, "fully solicit on my behalf that Mr. Adams may be preferred." The race was close, but in the end, John Adams came just ahead in the Electoral College. But back in that time, the person with the second most votes would become vice president. So Jefferson became vice president under John Adams. Now, there's a reason that we don't do it like that today. Because obviously, it's hard to have a president and vice president that don't share political views. Let's just say that Jefferson wasn't invited to many cabinet meetings, and he was rarely consulted on executive decisions. It's sad to see that through this period, and especially through the election that was soon to follow, Jefferson and Adams, who had previously been good friends and allies during the Revolution, became bitter political rivals. The Federalist policies, implemented over the next 4 years, gave rise to what Jefferson referred to as the Federalist Reign of Terror. French relations deteriorated so much that America found itself locked in an undeclared naval war with France, and anti-French sentiment began taking hold in the Federalist-controlled Congress. Congress actually ended up passing 4 laws known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. They were designed to suppress foreign, specifically French, and Republican resistance to the Adams administration. Allison explains, "The Naturalization Act extended from 5 to 14 years the residency requirement for American citizenship, while the Alien Act gave the president unlimited authority to expel any aliens he considered dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States. The Sedition Act, by far the most notorious of the bunch, authorized imprisonment of persons who conspired with intent to oppose any measure of the government, or who produced any false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the federal government or its officials." So, in other words, you could be fined or imprisoned for speaking out against the Adams administration, which Jefferson recognized as a direct violation of our First Amendment right to free speech. A number of editors of Republican newspapers were arrested for questioning the policies of the Adams administration, and citizens were jailed, fined, and persecuted. Needless to say, these policies did not go over very well with the American people, and this controversy was the beginning of the end of the Federalist Party in America. Despite the fact that it was well known that Jefferson wanted to return to private life, no one doubted that he was the one who needed to run against Adams in the next election, which he did. But in the end, Adams received so few votes that the contest actually came down to Jefferson and Aaron Burr, another Republican candidate, and yes, this is the Aaron Burr who will end up killing Hamilton in a duel. But Jefferson and Burr ended up tying for votes in the Electoral College, and it became a tense deadlock that turned to the House of Representatives to decide the victor. Those who observed Jefferson during this period were surprised by how calm he was, as if he had no personal interest in the outcome whatsoever. But this makes sense when you understand his motivation. He said, "I feel no impulse from personal ambition to the office now proposed to me. But I feel a sincere wish indeed to see our government brought back to its Republican principles, to see that kind of government firmly fixed to which my whole life has been devoted. I hope we shall now see it so established as that when I retire, I may be under full security that we are to continue free and happy. The outcome rested on the vote of one delegate, James A. Bayard, who told his Federalist colleagues that he was no longer willing to, quote, exclude Jefferson at the expense of the Constitution. He cast his vote, and Jefferson was elected as the third president of the United States. This is one of the most overlooked turning points in American history. It was critical that Thomas Jefferson be elected as president, and I'll explain why. But the 1800 election was a bitter one, and Jefferson was viciously attacked in the Federalist newspapers, something that unfortunately would accompany the rest of his time in politics. Alexander glanced back and forth at the paintings lining the corridors of the White House, his curious mind taking in as much detail as he could. A painting of George Washington was among them, along with other portraits, historical scenes, and maps. What a fascinating place America was, Alexander thought. He'd spent the past 5 years traveling through Latin America, but he hadn't been able to resist stopping in to see the United States, a people who knew how to appreciate the precious gift of liberty. Despite his aristocratic upbringing in Berlin, Alexander greatly believed in political freedom and individual rights. Besides, he'd been greatly intrigued to hear about America's recent acquiring of the Louisiana Territory and their plans for westward exploration. Alexander stopped in front of the president's cabinet room. When he entered, he found Mr. Jefferson seated by a table covered in newspapers. Though he'd had several visits with the president already, it still felt strange to be standing in the presence of a man whose writing, actions, and ideas had been an inspiration to him since he was a child. Alexander had been especially impressed with his notes on the state of Virginia, perhaps the greatest scientific work published in America. Since actually meeting him in person, Alexander was amazed at the wealth of knowledge he had in seemingly every area, from philosophy to music to agriculture, and he admired both Jefferson's remarkable scientific genius as well as his heroic actions on behalf of human rights. He had written to the president shortly after arriving in Philadelphia, and was thrilled when Jefferson had responded so positively to his letter, inviting him to come to Washington. Jefferson rose from his seat, greeting Alexander with a handshake and a warm smile. He offered him a chair, and Alexander sat down near the table. His eyes dropped to one of the newspapers, and he was stunned to recognize it as one of the most slanderous anti-Republican papers, one infamous for spewing attacks on Jefferson both politically and personally. Since arriving in America, Alexander had taken to reading the local newspapers, and was shocked at the barrage of insults and accusations leveled against the president. "Why are these libels allowed?" he suddenly asked, reaching forward to pick up the paper. "Why is not this libelous journal suppressed, or its editor at least fined and imprisoned?" Mr. Jefferson looked up at him, a soft weariness behind his smile. "Put that paper in your pocket, Baron, and should you hear the reality of our liberty, or the freedom of our press questioned, show this paper and tell where you found it." Alexander was stunned. Jefferson had the power to silence them, but chose not to. Was he truly so committed to free speech that he refused to infringe upon it, even when grossly false, vile things were being purported about his character? Even when his own honor was questioned? Clearly, Jefferson feared tyranny far more than he feared the opinion of the papers, and Alexander couldn't help but admire him all the more for it. In his role as President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson did a number of remarkable things. For one, he restored the freedom of speech and freedom of the press, deeming the Alien and Sedition Acts unconstitutional, and pardoned those who'd been fined and imprisoned under the previous administration. He also had their fines be repaid. Jefferson lowered the national debt and removed much of the pomp and formalities surrounding his office. He dressed simply. A senator from New Hampshire thought he was a servant until they were properly introduced. But even though he did away with many of the formal events and elaborate state dinners, Jefferson still did plenty of entertaining. He had guests at the White House almost every single day. But amazingly, he never used public funds to entertain his guests, even official representatives of foreign governments, which left him about $10,000 in debt by the time he left the presidency. His one consolation was of having, quote, added nothing to my private fortune during my public service, and of retiring with my hands as clean as they are empty. But despite how popular Jefferson's presidency was among the American people, he was excoriated in the press. As one biographer wrote, he suffered open personal attacks, which in severity and obscenity have rarely, if ever, been matched in presidential history in the United States. The most ardent opponent of Jefferson's was a man named James T. Callender. Callender came over here to America after facing charges of sedition from writing controversial things about the British government. Many saw him as a victim of British persecution, and even donated money to help him and his family. Jefferson was one of those. After arriving in America, Callender began writing for a pro-Republican newspaper, in other words, a pro-Jefferson newspaper, where he continued his same defamatory writing style against Federalist leaders, like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. Not surprisingly, he was one of those who was convicted under the Sedition Act during the Adams presidency. He was also one that Jefferson pardoned after he became president. But that wasn't enough for Callender. He viewed himself as having rendered the Jefferson administration a great service for his attacks on the Federalists during the previous presidential campaign. So he demanded that he be appointed as the postmaster of Virginia. Jefferson rightly refused, but this enraged Callender. And just like that, he went from being one of Jefferson's greatest supporters to his most vile critic. And significantly, it's from James T. Callender that we get the accusations of Jefferson having fathered children with his slave Sally Hemings. When we study things of this nature, it's important that we look at the source. Who said it, and why did they say it? According to historian James Truslow Adams, quote, almost every scandalous story about Jefferson, which is still whispered or believed, can be traced back to Callender. And historian John C. Miller described Callender as, quote, the most unscrupulous scandalmonger of the day, a journalist who stopped at nothing and stooped to anything. He was not an investigative journalist. He never bothered to investigate anything. For him, the story, especially if it reeked of scandal, was everything. Truth, if it stood in his way, was summarily mowed down. Even historian Benjamin Ellis Martin, who was a Jefferson-bashing critic himself, had absolutely nothing positive to say about Callender. Quote, I am unable to find one good word to speak of this man. He was a journalistic janizary, his pen always for sale on any side, a hardened and habitual liar, a traitorous and truculent scoundrel, and the world went better when he sank out of sight beneath the waters of the James River. This is a side note, but James Callender was a known alcoholic, and when he was intoxicated, he fell into the James River and drowned. Thus ended the life of this scandalmonger. Now, does that sound like a credible witness? I don't think so. And this becomes even more obvious as we look back at all of the proven inconsistencies in Callender's accusations. But first, just a little bit of context. Sally Hemings was a young slave who actually accompanied Thomas Jefferson's daughter Mary to France, acting as her maid. She was 14 years old at the time, and Jefferson was in his 40s. Calendar wrote, "It is well known that the man whom it delighted the people to honor, President Jefferson, keeps and for many years past has kept as his concubine one of his own slaves. Her name is Sally. The name of her eldest son is Tom. His features are said to bear a striking although sable resemblance to those of the president himself. The boy is 10 or 12 years of age. His mother went to France in the same vessel as Thomas Jefferson." Okay, first of all, they did not travel on the same vessel. Sally accompanied Mary several years after Jefferson had already been in France. And secondly, the DNA study that people say indisputably proves that Thomas Jefferson fathered Sally's children indicated that only one child showed Jefferson DNA. They tested 2 of them, Tom the eldest and Eston the youngest. The families of the other children did not submit to the study. Tom was found with no Jefferson DNA, and Eston was found with Jefferson DNA. But keep in mind that because Jefferson did not have any male descendants to pull DNA from, they had to use DNA from his uncle's family line, which is hardly ideal for a paternity test. As author David Barton explains, therefore, on the basis of DNA testing, the most the researchers could conclusively say was that some Jefferson male, and there were 26 Jefferson males living in the area at the time, had a relationship with Sally Hemings that resulted in the birth of Eston. And he continues, "A blue ribbon commission of 13 PhD scholars actually assembled to examine the issue and came to this conclusion, quote, there are at least 10 possible fathers for Sally Hemings' children who could have passed down genetic material that might produce children physically resembling Thomas Jefferson, and who were thought to have visited Monticello regularly during the years that Sally Hemings was having children." And after investigating the evidence, the group concluded that the, quote, case against Thomas Jefferson's relatives appears significantly stronger than the case against him. And national columnist Mona Charen summarized the point well when she said, "The DNA data did rule Jefferson out as the father of Thomas Woodson, the eldest of Sally's sons, and shed no light on the rest. That leaves a scenario in which Jefferson's sexual liaison with his slave, that produced Eston, is estimated to have begun when he was 65 years old. Possible, certainly, but likely? While the DNA adds to our knowledge, it is clear that there was a mixing of Hemings and Jefferson genes sometime in the past 200 years. They do not provide names or dates. They most definitely do not prove anything about Thomas Jefferson himself." The DNA investigation was conducted by the journal Science in 1998. Now, is the date significant? It certainly is, because if you'd picked up a newspaper in 1998, you'd probably see something about another scandal, that of President Bill Clinton's impeachment proceedings for lying under oath about his sexual misconduct with a young intern in the Oval Office. This becomes even more interesting when you learn that historian Professor Joseph Ellis, who wrote the article announcing the DNA test results, where he blatantly claimed that the results proved Jefferson to be the father of at least one of Hemings' children, was also a big Clinton supporter, even going so far as to say that President William Jefferson Clinton also has a vested interest in this DNA revelation. Not long before making this announcement, Ellis had even co-signed a New York Times ad opposing the impeachment of Clinton. So for many like Ellis, the DNA test was a much-needed cover for Clinton, putting forth the argument that all presidents have their sexual indiscretions, even Jefferson. One national columnist wrote, "What a relief. Now Jefferson can be brought down off the godlike pedestal on which some have tried to elevate him." The newspapers after this study had a field day, saying not only that Jefferson had fathered one child, but likely 4 or 5 of Hemings' children. And yet, Dr. Eugene Foster, who conducted the actual DNA study, acknowledged the limitations of his testing. The results were twisted and stretched by those like Joseph Ellis, who recognized it as political ammunition. The other thing that most people don't know is that 8 weeks after this initial craze in the news, the original DNA story was pulled and rewritten. Quietly, the scientific researchers acknowledged that the test didn't actually prove that Jefferson had fathered children with Sally Hemings. The results had been dramatically overstated, but the retraction got very little attention. As Barton put it, doing justice to Jefferson's reputation was not deemed in and of itself to be a worthy national consideration. Well, I find it very worthy of our consideration, so we're going to take a moment to do just that. Now, as we've already established, a lot of this comes from grossly over-exaggerating the DNA evidence. But much of the foundation that historians cling to, those who still want to believe this narrative, is actually rooted in oral tradition. Second-hand oral tradition, by the way. But as you'll see, the oral history is greatly undermined by the DNA evidence. In an article published in an Ohio newspaper in 1783, Madison Hemings, one of Sally's children, claimed that in France, quote, "My mother became Mr. Jefferson's concubine, and when he was called back home, she was enceinte, or pregnant, by him." So this alleged pregnancy would have been with Thomas Woodson, Sally's eldest child. But remember that Thomas Woodson came back with negative results for Jefferson DNA, so this should call his entire testimony into question. What we really need to be focusing on is the youngest child, Eston, the one that we actually do have DNA evidence proving a connection to the Jefferson family. And if it wasn't Jefferson, then who was it? There are a couple of likely candidates. One was Jefferson's younger brother, Randolph Jefferson, who, as one of the slaves at Monticello explains, quote, "used to come out among the black people and play the fiddle and dance half the night." Which, by the way, we don't have a single incident of Thomas Jefferson out socializing in that way among the slaves. There are also letters written by Thomas Jefferson to Randolph, inviting him, and presumably his sons, to come to Monticello shortly before Sally became pregnant with Eston. And it was common for visits of that kind to last for weeks. The Scholars Commission points out, quote, "We don't know exactly when Randolph's first wife died, but we do know that he remarried to a very controlling woman shortly after Eston Hemings was born. About the same time, Thomas Jefferson retired from public office and spent the rest of his life at Monticello, where he could presumably have had access to Sally Hemings any night he wished. But Sally, although only in her mid-30s, gave birth to no known children after Eston was born in 1808. Even the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation report acknowledges that Sally's childbearing years may have corresponded to the years in which Randolph Jefferson was a widower. So these details make Randolph a very likely candidate. In many ways, a much more likely candidate than Thomas Jefferson. But there is evidence against another Jefferson family member as well. Highly respected historian Douglas Adair used a recently discovered document written by a 19th century biographer, Henry Randall, who recounts a conversation that he had with Jefferson's grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, who spent most of his childhood at Monticello. As Allison explains, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, quote, confirmed what others close to the family had already disclosed, that Sally Hemings was actually the mistress of Jefferson's nephew, Peter Carr, and that their connection was perfectly notorious at Monticello. He also pointed out that there was not the shadow of suspicion that Mr. Jefferson in this or any other instance had commerce with female slaves. He said, Mr. Jefferson never locked the door of his room by day, and that he, Colonel Randolph, slept within the sound of his breathing at night. He said he had never seen a motion or a look or a circumstance which had led him to suspect for an instant that there was a particle more of familiarity between Mr. Jefferson and Sally Hemings than between him and the most repulsive servant in the establishment, and that no person ever living at Monticello dreamed of such a thing. Colonel Randolph said that he had spent a good share of his life closely about Mr. Jefferson, at home and on journeys, in all sorts of circumstances, and he fully believed him chaste and pure, as, quote, immaculate a man as God ever created. I so appreciate what Jefferson's grandson said about him, because I believe the greatest defense you can make against these claims is simply rooted in Jefferson's character. As Professor Dumas Malone, whose massive 6-volume biography of Jefferson was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for History in 1975, concluded, the idea that such accusations could be true is, quote, virtually unthinkable in a man of Jefferson's moral standards and habitual conduct. To say this is not to claim that he was a plaster saint and incapable of moral lapses, but his major weaknesses were not of this sort. It is virtually inconceivable that this fastidious gentleman, whose devotion to his dead wife's memory and to the happiness of his daughters and grandchildren bordered on the excessive, could have carried on through a period of years a vulgar liaison which his own family could not have failed to detect. It would be as absurd as to charge this consistently temperate man with being, through a long period, a secret drunkard. But Jefferson chose not to refute these claims, which many of his enemies interpret as a confession. But ignoring charges like this was what Jefferson had always done. He said, quote, I should have fancied myself half guilty had I condescended to put pen to paper in refutations of their falsehoods, or drawn to them respect by any notice from myself. As his grandson explained, Jefferson had not, quote, considered them as abusing him. They had never known him. They had created an imaginary being, clothed with odious attributes, to whom they had given his name. And it was against that creature of their imaginations they had leveled their anathemas. Justice William Patterson of the Supreme Court acknowledged, quote, no man can be personally acquainted with Mr. Jefferson and remain his personal enemy. After these slanders had circulated, Jefferson wrote privately that he, quote, feared no injury which any man could do me. I never had done a single act or been concerned in any transaction which I feared to have fully laid open, or which could do me any hurt if truly stated. And toward the end of his presidency, he said, I can conscientiously declare that as to myself, I wish that not only no act, but no thought of mine should be unknown. Jefferson had the power to stop the slandering. He could have done what the previous presidency had and silence his opponents. But he didn't, because he was so committed to free speech, to those God-given rights that he had written about in the Declaration of Independence. This was not a man living in constant opposition to his own self-proclaimed values, a man who spoke one way and then lived another. On the contrary, he was a man who stayed true to his deepest core values, even when he became, as he put it, a fair mark for every man's dirt. You can think what you want about Jefferson. I am simply trying to give you a case for his defense, because I believe him. I believe he was what he claimed to be, and I believe that he's worthy of our approbation. When Teddy Roosevelt was in Paris, he gave a speech titled Citizen in a Republic. A paragraph from that speech summarizes all of my feelings on this subject. He said, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dirt and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. Thomas Jefferson is a personal hero of mine for many reasons, but one of the greatest of which is that he was no passive observer in history. He didn't watch from the sidelines. He engaged in the cause of liberty with his whole heart and soul, even when it came at the great personal cost of his own wishes and desires. He said, "The whole of my life has been a war with my natural taste, feelings, and wishes. Domestic life and literary pursuits were my first and latest inclinations. Circumstances, and not my desires, led me to the path I have trod." And to those who choose to criticize Jefferson and think the worst of him, I would ask, what have you done for the liberty of mankind? How have you lent your life in the service of others? Are you merely watching from the sidelines, from the comfort of the bleachers? And the greatest irony is that we owe those very comforts and the ability to speak our minds in part to a man who spent his life securing our rights. Jefferson had the correct perspective. He never tried to silence his enemies because, as he said himself, the man who fears no truths has nothing to fear from lies. That is the whole intent behind this podcast, to present the truth so it can dispel deceptions and ignite our faith.